Biodiversity is a measurement of the number of different species that make up an ecosystem. And an ecosystem with greater biodiversity is considered to be healthier. When conditions change within a region, an ecosystem with more biodiversity is more likely to survive those changes, or more likely to be able to adapt to those changes, because even though some species may experience hardship and may not be able to survive, the more diversity means that some of those species are more likely to be fit for the new conditions that ecosystem experiences. Great biodiversity, however, can lead to confusion when we're trying to study the organisms in an environment. Scientists then now have to have a way to create order within a very biodiverse world. In this lesson, we will describe the goals of binomial nomenclature and taxonomy. We'll have to learn what those terms mean and how and why they're important. We'll explain how Linnaeus grouped species into larger taxa. Again, taxa is a new vocabulary word. Linnaeus is a scientist who grouped species into taxa. We will identify the 6 kingdoms of life as they are now identified. This is an example of a field guide that a bird watcher could buy in order to help identify birds in the wild. To help the birder in identification, a field guide provides some information on how to identify different anatomical parts of a bird so that you can have a vocabulary for describing the birds you see. And then the guide is organized by types of birds. So all the geese, swans, and ducks are put together in one area. And then we see cormorants and darters, loons and grebes, and so on. On what basis do you think these birds have been grouped in the book? Based on the second and third pages, we can infer that these birds have been grouped by physical similarities. The entry for each kind of bird includes a Latinate name in italics. This is what we refer to as a scientific name. Every organism has a scientific name that may be different from its common name. For example, for humans, we are Homo sapiens. Homo is the genus that humans belong to. Sapiens is our species. This is the format that's used for all scientific names, genus and species. So in this case, we will see it for birds in a bird book. We could see it for plants in a plant book. We could see it for bacteria in, I guess there's no bacteria book, or maybe there is, but we can see even bacterial species referred to by their scientific names, using the genus and the species. Taxonomy is the science of classifying and identifying organisms. Biologists identify and organize biodiversity through a standard system of taxonomy, a branching classification of all organisms based on shared characteristics that changes as new discoveries are made. Because a standardized taxonomic system is essential to the scientific community, it must be based on universally accepted rules for identifying and naming such species. Each scientific name must refer to one and only one species, and everyone must use the same name for that species. Common names can be confusing because they vary among languages and from place to place, even within the same language. Furthermore, different species may share a common name. In the United Kingdom, the word buzzards refers to a hawk, whereas in the United States, buzzard refers to a vulture. In the 1730s, Swedish botanist Carolus Linnaeus developed a two-word naming system called binomial nomenclature. In binomial nomenclature, each species is assigned a two-part scientific name. Binomial, bi means two, nomial means name, two name, and then nomenclature is the same root as nomial. So it's a two-word naming system. Scientific names are written in italics. The first word begins with a capital letter, and the second word is lowercase. The polar bear is called Ursus maritimus. The first part of the name, Ursus, is the genus to which the organism belongs. A genus, the plural of genus is genera. A genus is a group of similar species. The genus Ursus contains 5 other species of bears, including Ursus arctos, the brown bear or grizzly bear. The second part of a scientific name in these examples, maritimus or arctos, is unique to each species. A species, remember, is a group of individuals able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. The species name is often a description of an important trait of the organism's habitat. The Latin word maritimus refers to the sea because polar bears often live on pack ice that floats in the sea. Identify the genus and species of this organism on the right. Genus is Ursus, species is Arctos. The species Arctos also means bear. There is a difference between naming organisms and classifying them. Binomial nomenclature is a naming system in which every species gets a unique two-part name. Classification is the practice of putting things into groups. Binomial nomenclature and classification intersect with systematics. Systematics is the science of naming and grouping organisms. The scientific name for an organism represents part of its classification, since similar species are classified together in a genus. What is the scientific name for human beings? You probably know this is Homo sapiens. Homo is our genus, sapiens is our species. The scientific name for the domestic cat is Felis catus. What genus is the domestic cat a member of, and what is its species? The genus is Felis, F-E-L-I-S, and catus designates the species within the genus. In addition to naming organisms, biologists classify or categorize living and fossil species into larger groups. Organisms were originally categorized using a hierarchical classification system based strictly on similarities and differences shared among groups. In other words, in the old days, scientists used to look at the physical features that organisms had and put them in groups based on their physical features, or maybe to some extent based on their behaviors. Today, classification also groups organisms based on evolutionary relationships. The science of naming and grouping organisms is called systematics. The goal of systematics is to organize living things into groups that have biological meaning. Biologists often refer to these groups as taxa, T-A-X-A. Taxa is plural of taxon, T-A-X-O-N. Carolus Linnaeus also developed a branching classification system based on the similarities and differences shared among groups. His system organized species into taxa that formed a hierarchy or set of ordered ranks. Linnaeus's original system had just 4 levels. Over time, his original classification system expanded to include 7 hierarchical taxa: species, genus, family, order, class, phylum, and kingdom. We've already discussed the 2 smallest categories, species and genus. Now work your way up to the rank of kingdom by examining how camels are classified. A camel with 2 humps is Camelus bactrianus. Camelus bactrianus is a camel with 2 humps. As you can see, the genus Camelus also includes another species, Camelus dromedarius, the dromedary, which has only 1 hump. Bactria, the camel with 2 humps is Camelus bactrianus because it's named after Bactria, an ancient country in Asia. We often refer to as a camel with 1 hump as a dromedary. In deciding how to place organisms into these larger taxa, Linnaeus grouped species according to anatomical similarities and differences. In other words, their physical features. The South American llama bears some resemblance to Bactrian camels and dromedaries, but the llama is more similar to other South American species than it is to European and Asian camels. Therefore, llamas are placed in a different genus, Llama. Their species name is Llama glama. Several genera that share many similarities, like Camelus and Llama, are grouped into a larger category, the family. In this case, Camelidae. We can see the family Camelidae. Closely related families are grouped into the next larger rank, an order. Camels and llamas, family Camelidae, are grouped with several other animal families, including deer, the family Cervidae, and cattle, family Bovidae, into the order Artiodactyla. Artiodactyla includes all hoofed animals with an even number of toes. Similar orders, in turn, are grouped into the next larger rank, a class. The order Artiodactyla is placed in the class Mammalia, which includes all animals that are homeotherms or warm-blooded. They have body hair and produce milk for their young. Humans are actually in the same class as camels and cows and all these other organisms that you see pictured under Mammalia, and many, many more. Classes are grouped into a phylum. A phylum includes organisms that are different but share important characteristics. The class Mammalia is grouped with birds, class Aves, A-V-E-S, reptiles, class Reptilia, amphibians, class Amphibia, and all classes of fish into the phylum Chordata. Chordata includes all organisms that share important body plan features, among them a nerve cord along the back. The largest and most inclusive of Linnaeus's taxonomic categories is the kingdom. All multicellular animals are placed in the kingdom Animalia. Understand that the pyramid shows the taxonomic categories for one species, Camelus bactrianus, and that the more inclusive taxa include many more organisms than shown. Obviously, we couldn't have a picture with everything from kingdom Animalia in the bottom. In a sense, members of a species determine which organisms belong to their species by deciding with whom they will mate. There is thus a natural definition of species. Linnaean ranks above the level of species, on the other hand, are defined by researchers. Over time, new discoveries have emphasized different characteristics, so some larger taxonomic groups have been defined in different ways at different times. For example, Carl Linnaeus' strategy of classifying organisms strictly according to visible similarities and differences seems simple. But how should scientists decide which similarities and differences are most important? If you lived in Linnaeus' time, how would you have classified the animals shown? Adult barnacles and limpets live attached to rocks and have similar looking shells. Adult crabs look quite unlike both barnacles and limpets. Based on these features, one might place limpets and barnacles together and crabs in a different group. But as biologists attempted to classify more organisms over time, these kinds of questions arose frequently. Linnaeus was a good scientist, and he chose his characteristics carefully. Many of his groups are still valid under modern classification schemes, but Linnaeus worked more than a century before Charles Darwin published his ideas about common ancestry. Because classification changes as new discoveries are made, modern systematists apply Darwin's ideas to classification. They try to look beyond similarities and differences to ask questions about evolutionary relationships. Scientists today try to assign species to larger groups and to organize those groups in branching patterns in ways that reflect how closely members of those groups are related to each other. What did Linnaeus and traditional classification since his time depend on to classify organisms? Well, they depended on overall similarities and differences. So think about why classification of dolphins might have been a problem with traditional classification. They look kind of like fish, they act kind of like fish, but they're mammals. They're mammals. They have stronger evolutionary ties to us than they do to fish. The process of identifying and naming all known organisms, living and extinct, is a huge first step toward the goal of systematics. Yet naming organisms is only part of the work. The real challenge is to group everything, from bacteria to dinosaurs to blue whales, in a way that reflects their evolutionary relationships. Over the years, Linnaeus' original scheme for naming organisms has changed as new discoveries have been made. That change continues today as studies at the molecular level accumulate new data. During Linnaeus' time, the only known differences among living things were the fundamental characteristics that separated animals from plants. Animals were organisms that moved from place to place and used food for energy. Plants were green organisms that generally did not move and got their energy from the sun. As biologists learned more about the natural world, they realized that Linnaeus' two kingdoms, Animalia and Plantae, did not reflect the full diversity of life. Classification systems have changed dramatically since Linnaeus' time. Hypotheses about relationships among organisms are still changing today as new data are gathered. Can you identify the difference between the kingdoms of the 5-kingdom system and the kingdoms of the 6-kingdom system? In the five-kingdom system, all bacteria were included in one kingdom, Monera. In the six-kingdom system, bacteria are split into two kingdoms, eubacteria and archaebacteria. Advanced technology such as DNA analysis is providing new information that has caused biologists to rethink how organisms should be classified. As researchers begin to study microorganisms, they discover that single-celled organisms were significantly different from plants and animals. At first, all microorganisms were placed in their own kingdom named Protista. Then yeasts and molds, along with mushrooms, were placed in their own kingdom, fungi. Later still, scientists realized that bacteria lack the nuclei, mitochondria, and chloroplasts found in other forms of life. All prokaryotes, bacteria, were placed in yet another new kingdom, Monera. Single-celled eukaryotic organisms remained in the kingdom Protista. This processing produced five kingdoms: Monera, Protista, Fungi, Plantae, and Animalia. By the 1990s, researchers had learned a great deal about the genetics and biochemistry of bacteria. The 1990s, that was not so long ago. That knowledge made clear that the organisms in kingdom Monera were actually two genetically and biochemically different groups. As a result, the Monerans were separated into two kingdoms, eubacteria and archaebacteria, bringing the total number of kingdoms to six. The six-kingdom system of classification includes the kingdoms eubacteria, archaebacteria, Protista, fungi, Plantae, and Animalia. What organisms do you know of that fit into each of these six kingdoms? Think about it. Today, organisms are grouped into three domains and six kingdoms. This table summarizes the key characteristics used to classify organisms into these major taxonomic groups. Genomic analysis has revealed that the two main prokaryotic groups are even more different from each other and from eukaryotes than previously thought. So biologists established a new taxonomic category even higher than the kingdom, which they call the domain. A domain is a larger, more inclusive category than a kingdom. Under this system, there are three domains: bacteria, which corresponds to the kingdom Eubacteria, Archaea, which corresponds to the kingdom Archaebacteria, and Eukarya. Eukarya includes kingdoms Fungi, Plantae, Animalia, and Protista. These are also known as eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are organisms whose cells contain true nuclei, and they also contain mitochondria and chloroplasts. The quotations around the old kingdom Protista are used because this is a paraphyletic group. Recent research shows that there is no way to put all unicellular organisms into a clade that contains a single common ancestor, all of its descendants, and only those descendants. Because only monophyletic groups are valid under evolutionary classification, we use quotations to show that this is not a true clade. Again, classification systems change as new discoveries are made. In other words, I know that was not super clear, but if you look at kingdom Animalia, all animals can trace their evolution back to one common ancestor. That is not true for Protista. Protists are not able to be traced back to one common ancestor. Which kingdoms do you see that are prokaryotic and which are eukaryotic? Well, the prokaryotic kingdoms are Eubacteria and Archaebacteria, and then everything else is eukaryotic. Again, eukaryotes are organisms that have true nuclei and membrane-bound organelles. Which kingdoms have cell walls and which have chloroplasts? Well, this shows us that bacteria, archaea, and well, basically everything except Animalia has some kind of cell walls. We also see that only Plantae and some Protista have chloroplasts. Which kingdoms are unicellular and which are multicellular? Meaning that an organism consists of only one cell or multiple cells. Well, bacteria and archaea are always unicellular. Protista are usually unicellular, and fungi are sometimes unicellular, as are Plantae. Animalia are always multicellular. Most Plantae and fungi are also multicellular, meaning they're made up of more than one cell. Which kingdoms contain autotrophs and which contain heterotrophs? We should be familiar with these terms. Autotrophs are organisms that make their own food. Heterotrophs are organisms that feed on other organisms. Well, let's look at some examples of each of these kingdoms. Each of these kingdoms. So eubacteria are the bacteria that we're familiar with. Streptococcus, which causes, Streptococcus or E. coli. Those are bacteria that sometimes are disease-causing in humans and other organisms, other organisms that we're familiar with. Archaea includes methanogens and halophiles. These are organisms that live under extreme conditions. Methanogens live in areas with high concentrations of methane, which is poisonous to most organisms. And halophiles live in very, very, very high salt environments where other organisms can't live. That's common for archaea, is that they exist in extreme conditions often, like the bottom of the ocean. Protista are usually single-celled organisms like amoeba, paramecia, slime molds, or giant kelp. Giant kelp, of course, are larger, as you can tell by their name. Fungi that includes mushrooms and yeasts. Yeasts are the things that make bread rise and through respiration we've learned about. Cellular respiration. So we use yeast to make bread rise and to make beer and wine because they go through alcoholic fermentation. Plantae are mosses, ferns, and flowering plants. They're most of the plants that we know. And then Animalia includes sponges, worms, insects, fishes, mammals, and really any other mammal or any other animal you can think of.